The war in Afghanistan, which began in 2001 in the wake of the September 11 attacks, has been the longest war in American history. Operating until 2014 under the name Operation Enduring Freedom, and since under the name Operation Freedom Sentinel, the war against the Taliban has been deemed an unwinnable one. As of 2018, 25,000 people had lost their lives as a result of this war, and as of 2019, there remained over 17,000 NATO troops stationed in Afghanistan. With the focus of the war having shifted from combat to training and resistance, in this episode, we trace our steps back. How did the US and NATO end up in this unwinnable war? What were the strategic and humanitarian errors made along the way? And what, if anything, has the war achieved, and at what cost? Joining me today to answer these questions, we have British journalist Carlotta Gall. Carlotta was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of Afghanistan and Pakistan for the New York Times. In 2014, she published her book, The Wrong Enemy, which focused on Pakistan's role in the war in Afghanistan. We have Matthew Ho, a former Marine and now a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. He resigned from the State Department in 2010 over the escalation of the war in Afghanistan and has since become a renowned peace activist. We have Marvin Weinbaum, who is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Illinois and the Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies at the Middle East Institute. And finally, we have Ben Anderson, who is a British journalist, filmmaker, and correspondent for Vice Media. He has written several books and produced several award-winning films about the war in Afghanistan, including Battle for Marja and This Is What Winning Looks Like. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. I wanted to start us off right at the beginning by going to you, Carlotta, and asking you to give us a bit of background into into the war. Your connection with Afghanistan goes far back, starting with the war in Chechnya in 1994. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the years leading up to 2001, including the rise of the Taliban regime and its connections with Al-Qaeda, and set the scene for the war.
Gosh, how far do you go back? Maybe to my first trip to Afghanistan, which was in the 1990s, but I became interested in Afghanistan because of the Russian invasion. I was a Russian scholar at Cambridge and was fascinated with the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, which became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, as it were. So finally, they, after a 10-year war, withdrew, and then you had the Mujahideen who'd been resisting against the Russians who came to power, and then it became a whole mess. And of course, the West was also to blame because they had deserted Afghanistan. They left the Mujahideen to their own devices. They fought each other. They had heavy involvement from Iran and Pakistan, among others, to backing various factions. And so it became a very ugly, messy wrestle for power. And then the Taliban rose up as part of that, backed heavily by Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and with some encouragement from the US at the beginning, because they thought this was perhaps the solution. And of course, the Taliban took over in 96 in Kabul, and it was a disaster. It was sort of back to the medieval times. Women, sent home, schools closed, and a very brutal civil war continued as they tried to take the north of the country. And so that was the scenario in 2001 when 9/11 happened. And of course, as you all know, Osama bin Laden, who was responsible for 9/11, was living in Afghanistan and running his training camps and organizing his terror attacks from there. And the Taliban government was hosting him, and despite urging from the West to stop him or hand him over, they never did. So that was the scenario that brought the American intervention in Afghanistan after 9/11. And I don't know where you were at the time, but I was actually in the Balkans covering Kosovo and Serbia and Macedonia. And the feeling I remember then was immediately I saw the planes going in. I happened to be in a hotel and saw it happening live. I said, that's bin Laden, it has to be. So people like me, and I'm sure Marvin and others who were following events there knew what was going on, but the world was completely shocked. And then the next thing I remember was the world generally came round behind America because it was such a shocking attack against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and so on, that they then had, I think, great understanding and world backing to intervene in Afghanistan. And so there was, although the Bush administration just went ahead, I think there was world support at that time, feeling that it was justified to go after the perpetrators. So perhaps I'll stop there, because that's when it all began, in the American intervention.
So to bring you in here then, Matthew, could you describe to us the early negotiations between the Bush administration and the Taliban regime and how it eventually led to the declaration of war in October that year?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on. This is great. I was thinking the other day that your institution is only a generation or two younger than our government here in the U.S. So it's a real pleasure to be a part of this, I would, just to piggyback on what Carlotta was describing, you could back up this war all the way to when I was born. I was born in 1973, and that's the year the king is deposed. And so for anyone who is an Afghan, for the last 40 some odd years of their life, there has been at best political chaos and at worst all-out war. And I think it's important to note how culpable the United States has been. And I was thinking about the title of this podcast is Peace, a Lost Cause in Afghanistan. And, I was thinking more along the lines of, should this conversation be, is peace under an American empire or under American foreign policy a lost cause? So, if you go back to, say, 1979, the Soviet Union invades in December of 1979, the United States actually started supporting the Mujahideen groups, the Islamist militant groups in Afghanistan, 6 months prior to the Soviet Union's invasion. And this is detailed in the biographies of Bill Gates and Zygmunt Brzezinski, who were both senior American officials all through their lives. The idea was that we were going to cause unrest in Afghanistan, which would then cause Muslim unrest in the southern regions of the Soviet Union, light the Soviet Union's underbelly on fire. And so to stop that, they'll invade Afghanistan. So we're baiting them into Afghanistan to give them, as Carlotta said, their own Vietnam. And, that's what happens, and then this notion that the United States walked away or abandoned Afghanistan when the Soviets left is not true. The United States actually continues funding the Mujahideen groups for several years after the Soviet Union leaves. And it's only when the communist government in Kabul falls, 3 years after the Soviet Union is left, that the United States stops supporting the Mujahideen groups. So the United States never has an interest in peace in Afghanistan. And so when you get to the 9/11 attacks and you get to these negotiations between the United States and the Taliban, how limited they were. But if you look at, the words of, say, a guy like Bob Grenier, who was a CIA station chief in Pakistan during that time. If you look at the reporting from, the New York Times or the Post at that time, the Taliban are trying to speak to the United States. And they are offering, the way the offer had gotten to was that they're willing to give bin Laden to a third party if the United States presents evidence. And President Bush says, no, that's not negotiable. And by mid-October, 5 weeks or so after the 9/11 attacks, the United States attacks and invades Afghanistan. And along with that, I think that this long misconception of the war, are two myths that go along with the 9/11 attacks that still pervade. And one is that the 9/11 attackers attacked us because they hate our freedoms. And that helps sustain the war in the United States, or support for the war in the United States, this fear-based notion that there are these evil people coming out of caves. And that's simply not the case. It's very clear, if you ever read the transcripts of the 9/11 hijackers, they all very clearly have grievances One is that they are upset about the United States sanctions against Iraq that are killing hundreds of thousands of people. They're upset about the presence, as well as, too, in the 90s, at times on a weekly basis, the United States was bombing Iraq. And they're upset about that. They're upset about the presence of U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia, which is they view as a real issue in terms of for their own religion and the custody of their religion. And then the third thing is they are upset about the United States' relationship with Israel. So whether or not you agree with their grievances, you have to admit that they are legitimate grievances and that they're not doing this because our women here wear short skirts, as President Bush and other political leaders in the U.S. would have you believe. The second myth about the attacks is this myth of the safe haven, that somehow that the United States has to go and wage this land war with hundreds of thousands of troops at a cost of $1 trillion, basically, in order to prevent another 9/11. And this is based on the notion that somehow Al-Qaeda needs a safe haven in Afghanistan, or any terror group needs a safe haven in Afghanistan. And, if you look at what the FBI says, if you look at what journalists like Peter Bergen or others say, at the time, guys like Ali Soufan, who was an FBI agent, at the time of 9/11, Al-Qaeda had between 200 and 400 members worldwide. So this idea that you're going to go on and take on a war against a group of that size is just farcical, right? The other aspect of this is that this idea that they need to be in Afghanistan. The majority of the planning and preparation took place in Germany, in Hamburg, which is called the kitchen of the 9/11 cell, or in Pakistan, where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who the mastermind of the attacks, was located. As well as planning took place in Spain and Malaysia, possibly Dubai. And of course, the most important safe haven for the 9/11 attackers in preparation for their attacks was the American flight academies and martial arts academies. We had 9/11 attackers in the U.S. For 18 months prior to the attacks. The attackers were spent more time in Pakistan, certainly in Germany, and in the United States than they ever did in Afghanistan. So this notion of safe haven still pervades, and still, if you look at op-eds over the last year or two written against the idea of a peace process of Afghanistan, you will see both these two myths continue to rise. And these are the myths that allow the United States to plunge into war in Afghanistan, to silence any critics, and to continue along this idea of what was, in the 1990s, as the Cold War dies down, you have a number of scholars, whether it be Samuel Huntington or Francis Fukuyama, who come out with these ideas about clashes of civilization. And this really feeds into the foreign policy egos and the foreign policy ideals of the West. And so it's very important for us to understand, when we're talking about the background of these wars, the supporting narratives that go along with these wars, and why, 19 years later, the war is basically, it's never been able to be won. And why is that? Why do we still go along with it? And I think you have to go back and examine those myths and understand the narratives that have supported the war.
So I just wanted to go to you now, Marvin, to ask about the ISAF, which is the International Security Assistance Force, which is established by the UN to train Afghan forces against the Taliban. So I just wanted to ask, how did this organization kind of feed into this narrative that Matthew has just talked about, and how effective was it?
Well, first of all, I can't really respond, and I will talk about the force that we had in Afghanistan. But against this kind of explanation for the U.S. role in the region, I just can't let it stand. Mm-hmm. I understand a great deal of what has been said here reflects, I think, a good knowledge of the region and so on. I first started going to Afghanistan 50 years ago and saw it through this entire period as an academic and then as a security analyst, intelligence analyst on Afghanistan in the U.S. State Department. So I'm sorry, but I see a lot of the conspiracy theories that I've heard so much about that I've really, I think, distort what are honest criticisms. And let me just say that there have been at least 6 civil wars in Afghanistan, of which we have not been directly involved with. Most of them have been from the very time that I got there in the 70s, have been Islamic challenges against the state authority, the more secularly oriented state authority. And these have continued. In every one of them, there has been outside interference, not just by the United States, but by others as well. The Saudis, the Russians, of course, the Pakistanis. So it's just too neat a package, and it becomes a whipping boy for the United States. We've got a lot to atone for, but I don't want to take on that burden that has been laid on us by this kind of narrative. Now, with respect to American training, we were there in the early, after 9/11, we were there in very small numbers. There was an international contingent which could very well have played, I think, a very important role in securing the country and keeping warlords from emerging. But we were all wrapped up at that time, and I can speak to this from an inside position. We were all wrapped up here with planning for Iraq. We never made much of a commitment in Afghanistan. We didn't want to get involved because we thought this would detract us from what was to be an ill-conceived decision to go into Iraq. We didn't really think about training, going clearly to your question, we didn't think about training the Afghans in any large numbers. We thought, first of all, there wasn't very much of an insurgency to deal with. It wasn't until 2005, 6, that when I was in Kabul at that time, when I detected that we had recognized that we had a real insurgency on our hands. Up to that point, the number of American troops remained at first about 5,000. Ultimately, it did go to 20,000. But there was a failure here to really adjust American strategy as the insurgency took on a much more aggressive posture. So let me just conclude here to say that what we had then was an effort here to work to train, because your question really goes to the training. We did work ultimately to train the Afghan army with the idea that it would stand up on its own, looking for ways in which we could remove some of our own troops. But this was very slow in getting started. We deployed more than the United States. Some 40 countries participated in various ways, particularly in the provincial reconstruction teams. They had all kinds of problems. I don't want to go into that, but let me just conclude on this by saying that let's never look for explanations which sort of totally wrap up all of the open, unanswered questions. It's much more complex than that, and all of the people that I think have been cited here reflect that. They don't have a single view, but a much more complex view, and I think that one should take that into account as well.
So, Matthew, I will give you a chance to respond to this, but before that, I just wanted to bring in Ben and ask what you think about this kind of disagreement in the narrative.
I mean, I don't think it's my job to dispute the reasons for going in. I started going to Afghanistan in 2007 and covered, UK, US, then Afghan operations and the training of the Afghan security forces. I mean, just to add to what Marvin said, there was a period very early on where, if you look at the brilliant work of Michael Semple, for example, the Taliban were absolutely willing to support the government of Hamid Karzai and do some kind of a deal. But people forget, on the same day that Bush declared victory in Iraq, Rumsfeld was in Kabul declaring victory too. We thought the Taliban had been vanquished in no time at all, and that just wasn't the case. Many of them had just, gone back to their villages to see what happened next. And I believe one of the biggest mistakes of the war was handing control of the intelligence services, army and police to the Northern Alliance, who promised that they wouldn't, seek revenge and rape and pillage as had happened earlier, but would actually be a national security force. And that just didn't happen. Taliban members were hunted, captured, tortured, killed, sent to Guantanamo Bay. And so eventually, by 2006, 2007, you had a really strong insurgency, particularly in the south and east of the country. And it was only after that the training mission became serious. And by that point, it was far too late. And we can talk about it later if you want. But the training mission, even back then, as early as 2007, 2008, was clearly not going to work. I mean, I've spent lots of time with Afghan security forces, and even with me there with a camera, I've seen them kidnapping civilians for ransom, smoking opium and weed, being completely high while on patrols, taxing people at checkpoints, firing indiscriminately into villages they suspect of being Taliban sympathizers, and abducting and raping young boys and having them as child boys, as servants during the day, and then sex slaves at night. This was widespread and well known as early as 2006, 2007, and was never properly addressed.
So I just wanted to turn now to the resurgence specifically and the reasons behind it. And Carlotta, I wanted to bring you in here to talk about the role Pakistan played in bringing the Taliban effectively back to power by 2005, 2006.
Yeah, because this is very important. I have to catch you up, Ben, on that, is that the Taliban didn't go back to their villages. That was the whole point. They left for Pakistan. And it wasn't the Northern Alliance down in the south. Northern Alliance didn't go further than Logar, and I know because I was there, following them all. It was pro-American Pashtun commanders that took power in the south, and a lot of them were Karzai supporters. And you're right, a lot of them pursued Taliban, but the Taliban all went lock, stock and barrel to Quetta. And I know because I went to Quetta and I saw them, and you would see them, they would gather every Thursday evening, on a square at a mosque, and I interviewed some of them. So that's where they were. And
I'm aware they fled to Pakistan. I'm just talking about the what did they used to call them? The reconcilable Taliban who stayed and possibly could have.
No, all of the Taliban left, not the reconcilable or non-reconcilable. I mean, even the ones who had long relations with the Northern Alliance, like Bagrani, he left for Pakistan. None of them stayed.
The leaders.
And then, people like Mutawakkil, did try and work with the Americans, and yes, he got detained. Even the, Haqqani, one of the brothers of the Haqqanis, came over and was living in a guest house in Kabul for a while. He then got detained. So there were American efforts which went wrong. But the Taliban, everyone who was connected to the Taliban left for Quetta because they didn't know what was going to happen. And slowly, anyway, to answer your question, Mahi, they did start to come back. And I interviewed them in 2002, 2003 in Quetta. But I also started following all the early attacks where suddenly someone was running around with guns and attacking local police stations and so on. And so I tracked all that early activity. It really got bad in 2006 when I suddenly realized, wow, they're about to try and take power in provincial capitals. They suddenly were enormous. But I saw it, and I was down there the whole time, and we saw it steadily getting worse and worse. And a lot of the pro-government, pro-Karzai people were saying, that village we took to 6 months ago, we couldn't go there now, even if we had 200 soldiers, so you could feel the creeping gathering. And what it was, and this was the most fascinating for me, we're in trouble here in Pakistan because the Pakistani intelligence is saying you have to go and fight. And we can't stay, our families are not safe, our businesses we set up are not safe unless we go and fight. So there was a concerted effort by Pakistani intelligence to to reconstruct and restart the Taliban. And people started joining and doing it because if you're told you'll go to prison, some people were imprisoned because they didn't want to. Some people skipped to Karachi or Dubai. But a lot of people started organizing. And of course, when they did come back to Afghanistan, they found actually they were welcome. They could move around. The security wasn't as strong as they thought. And so they started to rebuild and start to operate. But it was a very concerted effort from Pakistan. And then as we realized over the years, I spent years there, the Taliban who did want peace would tell you, we can't talk freely in Pakistan. We can't operate or try and talk to the government safely if we're in Pakistan. And they were worried, about families and businesses and so on. So it became extremely difficult for a lot of them to operate, except to fight and to oppose the American and the Karzai government. And that's how it happened. And I first really came across the scale of the Pakistani involvement when I started tracking suicide bombers who'd been doing suicide bombings in Afghanistan in 2006, mostly in Kandahar. And the burials were happening back home in Quetta or in the Pashtun villages around Quetta. And that's when we realized that there was a sort of almost a factory of training and indoctrinating people almost to go and do suicide bombings. And the families were very unhappy about it. But the mosques and the religious parties were clearly recruiting people and sending them off. And there was a whole rash of suicide bombings in 2006. That's when it really started to explode. And it was clearly an orchestrated campaign. And then I got beaten up, for reporting that. A lot of my sources got hunted down and forced to flee Quetta. And then there was a very clear reaction from the Pakistani intelligence to stop that reporting. And so foreign journalists after that found it very difficult to go to Quetta and talk to the Taliban because it was absolutely not what the Pakistan wanted to happen.
So I was wondering, Ben or Matthew, if you could jump in here and tell us about the role the opium industry played in this resurgence, and how it acted kind of as an economic stimulus for the resurgence.
Just quickly, I think one of the few success stories of Afghanistan is the booming opium trade. I think 80% of the world's opium is still coming from Afghanistan. I went out with the counter-narcotics police numerous times, and they would destroy the crops of their rivals and protect the crops of their bosses. In Helmand, about 3 years ago, I spent 3 weeks with the counter-narcotics police chief of Helmand, who had an opium field inside the walls of his base. Which was something I'd never seen before. But yeah, an absolute driver of the conflict, especially in the south.
Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, there's been this misconception that the Taliban have drove that resurgence in the opium, and it was not. It was the biggest drug lords and the main machine behind the opium trade in Afghanistan has been the Afghan government. That's very clear. Whether it was big individuals like the president's half-brother, Akhnawali Karzai, or the Minister of Defense, Marshal Fahim, or warlords like Muhammad Atta-Nur or Golag Ashurzai, as well as then down as Ben described at the lower levels. The Taliban, does get a good amount of money from the opium trade. That's because they tax it as if they would tax anything else. And Afghanistan has no other industry other than opium. And so that's why that gets taxed so heavily. But as Carlotta was describing, also, too, they receive support from the Pakistanis, very serious support. But they also get a lot of money from the U.S. development program or the International Development Program. They would siphon off, whether it be because family members would be doing the construction or because they would tax that development money as well. But the chief, and I can tell this, the chief supporter of the Taliban in terms of money, and I can tell this because, I was read into all the intelligence for years on this, was from the Gulf monarchies. was from the Saudis and the Bahrainis and the Qataris and the Kuwaitis. That's where the chief financial support for the Taliban has been for the last 20 years. And it's not a conspiracy theory, as was stated earlier, to say these things, and it also, too, by stating certain things about the war doesn't mean that other things aren't untrue, or by pointing out the complexities of the war, stating from the United States side or from the UK side, which, look, we're talking to a US and a UK and a Western audience. How many Afghans are going to be listening to this? And the same manner when I brought up earlier about whether we should change the title of this to talking about American foreign policy, because if you go from the west of Africa, from Mali, all the way straight across to Pakistan, it is a world that is plunged in war. It is a world war. And the chief similarity in all of those conflicts is the primacy of American involvement. Whether it be a direct involvement or whether it be through proxies or whether it be through funding, et cetera. So I think there's a lot to look into this and to broaden this. But certainly, yeah, with regards to the Taliban, there were multiple streams of funding for them. And as I'll say, I mean, the chief driver of that opium resurgence was not the Taliban, but rather the Afghan government, which, prospered from. And I was with them when, just as Ben described, and I was with them, working out of the U.S. Embassy and on provincial reconstruction teams and everything else, and saw exactly what Ben saw.
So, Carlotta, if I let you respond to that very, very quickly, and then we'll go to Marvin.
Well, it's a huge subject, but just because after I was in Afghanistan, I went to live in Tunisia, and I saw, the post-Arab Spring spread of support for it was the Islamic State, but also Al-Qaeda spreading through Africa. And I don't think it's foreign policy that they're all guided from. There's clearly of belief whether to go and fight a jihad or to remove the tyrants of their incredibly authoritarian regimes that so many of them rose up against in 2011 in the Arab Spring. So there's a lot of the youth. Tunisia had a huge amount who rushed to Iraq. They weren't against American foreign policy. They were rushing to do something that they thought was, at the beginning, they thought it was a democratic uprising that they could help with. And then it was when ISIS became very strong and Al-Qaeda offered them opportunities, it's power. And so going back to the Taliban, since we're talking about Afghanistan, the Taliban were fighting for power. And they still are fighting for power. And they're not fighting against American foreign policy or women wearing short skirts. They want power. And Pakistan would like them in power because they're their client. And so that's where, if we're talking about where things went wrong or how things could have worked out better, there had to be, perhaps a long time ago, a plan to bring them in or find a way for Afghans to share power. Now, that's incredibly hard, as Marvin has said, because Afghans, are very divided and like to fight rather than perhaps give or compromise or give way. But the Taliban, as Lakhdar Brahimi then said at the early years of the American intervention, was the Taliban should have been at the Bonn conference. They should have been allowed a chair in the future. I think that was actually unrealistic at the time because the atrocities that had happened while they were in power were too strong. But subsequently, definitely, they should have been brought in. And I think now the efforts to bring them in, although I don't agree with the deal that's been proposed, I think it won't work because long term it's not a good deal for all sides. But there's definitely, you've got to have this conversation, and you have to. It's a shame General Petraeus is not here because he always expounded his plan for counterinsurgency with a very good diagram which shows all the different parts of the struggle that have to be brought together. So it's not just fighting, it's not just providing security on the ground, which I've always thought is critical, but it's doing diplomacy, including regional diplomacy, so that you have all the surrounding countries and the wider arc from Russia to Saudi Arabia involved and, pledging their own commitments towards some sort of peace. You've got to have every element. You've got to have internal training and peace efforts, and you've got to get the economy going and trade so that Pakistan starts to benefit from Afghan trade rather than thinking they should stop it. So it has to be a huge multi-sided, multilateral effort. And that's what I think was always lacking in Afghanistan. Marvin quite correctly says, as soon as America went off to Iraq, we knew Afghanistan was going to be shortchanged right from that moment, and never finishing the problem of the tribal areas of Pakistan, in Waziristan, where Al-Qaeda reconstituted and kept going, and the Taliban were disasters for Afghanistan. And now I think it's going to be the lack of international efforts and interest is going to make it very difficult to solve.
So, Marvin, to bring you in on this specifically, if you wanted to respond to that, and also...
Well, I would like to respond to Carlina, because I think when she mentions rightly that the Taliban seek power, they're not a transnational-minded organization. They want power in Kabul. But I would say it's not power in the usual sense here of the kind of power struggles that go on among the political influentials, the power brokers, whatever you want to call them. It's not, they do have an ideological basis also for their pursuing a militant course. And that is something which I think we tend to underestimate here. We take it as just perhaps a bargaining position, perhaps as something which can be compromised. But I believe it's very important to recognize that the Taliban do honestly want to see a Sharia observant state. They do want the return, as they see it, to at least their conception of an Islamic emirate. And I think if we discount that, we would fail to understand why making peace now is so important. Or how difficult it is, I should say, because it's not as though we can have a power sharing, which is the formula that everybody recognizes. Yes, they would have been perhaps useful to have at Bonn, but the truth is they probably could never have agreed on an outcome, a framework for a new government had the Taliban been a voice in Bonn. They had enough difficulty as it was. But what is so difficult now is that we continue to believe that all we need here is a formula, a power-sharing formula, which would grant the Taliban at least a piece of what becomes of this successor government. The fact is, they are interested here in the restoration of an emirate. Now, they say, yes, we have learned from the past, and so we'll be more inclusive, or we'll be more tolerant. But the truth is that if pressed, we find out it's always on their terms. They have no problem here with peace. You can have peace in Afghanistan tomorrow if you want to do it on their terms. This is the difficulty. So those who believe that Afghanistan has accomplished something in the last 20 years, and again, those of us who have followed it over a long period of time know that this Afghanistan has human capital, which is so admirable and that had never existed before, and that is worth preserving along with the rights that have been won in the last 20 years, which should not be minimized. With everything else that's gone wrong, there have been positive changes there. And so no one, I think, is prepared, certainly as majorities have shown, is prepared to let that slip in an agreement. And I think we have to keep that certainly in mind as to what is possible. I'll add one more thing. All of the negotiations that have taken place to date, in all of that, it's hard to find that the Taliban have ever yielded on any important points. It has been the government which has regularly accepted what is called a compromise, and I believe that is an indication here of how unified, at least at that level, they are in their objective here to restore the kind of government that they consider to be legitimate, and that any other form is simply an implant from the Western influences.
Taking a few steps back slightly, I did just want to touch on, for the interest of time, the Obama administration. And Ben, going to you, you said you've been working in Afghanistan since 2007, shortly after which, of course, the Bush administration was replaced by the Obama administration. Could you tell us a bit about how things changed on the ground then? And then I'll go to you, Matthew, to talk about the strategic direction.
Mm-hmm.
Just to back up quickly what Marvin said as well, the Taliban described the recent deal as a day of victory because all of their demands were met, and I don't think there'll be any more compromising when they actually deal directly with the Afghan government. So certainly my Afghan friends are very afraid about what happens next. In terms of when Obama took power, I mean, I think he knew the war was going badly. He ordered a long 6-month review. He described it as the most agonizing decision of his presidency. The result was the surge in Helmand province, in Marja, a relatively small farming district that was controlled by the Taliban, and a new counterinsurgency policy, and a huge operation. I think the biggest operation of the entire war since the initial invasion. And it was rolling out this new counterinsurgency policy of clear, hold, build, transfer. So clear Marja of the Taliban, hold on to that territory because territory elsewhere hadn't been held onto properly. Build infrastructure, introduce the government, quick impact projects to impress local people, and then transfer to Afghan forces. I was there the day the Marines landed. The fighting lasted 4 or 5 weeks. They did build lots of local government projects. They did employ thousands of local Afghans and pay them very, very well. I've been back to Marja several times since. It's now mostly back in the hands of the Taliban. I found a family that I'd spent time with where the children, aged 10, 12, and 14 years old, were fighting to defend their home, and where their grandmother was kidnapped by the Taliban and eventually safely returned. And at that point, Obama had predicted victory and withdrawal by the end of 2014, I believe. And obviously, that didn't happen, which tells you how badly the surge and Operation Mushtarak in Helmand went.
So, Matthew, if you could jump in on this and kind of explain to us perhaps the strategic failures that you think led to the situation being to where it is today, and what eventually led to your resignation.
Yeah, well, I was there in 2009, and I had been in part of operations in Iraq a couple of times before, including during the surge in Iraq. And all my time previous before that was either the State Department or the Pentagon working on war policy, basically. So when, as Marvin said, when in 2005, 2006, there's about 5,000 American forces in Afghanistan. When President Obama comes into office in January of 2009, its number's about 30,000 now. Within a year, he has increased that to 100,000 U.S. forces, added an additional 30,000 NATO forces, so Brits, Canadians, Norwegians, et cetera, and 100,000 contractors. And spending for the war, just the U.S. side alone, is up to $125 billion a year in terms of appropriations from Congress. So it's a massive movement of forces. And what you see is you never see any success. There is not one district, not one village in Afghanistan that becomes pacified, to use a term from Vietnam, right? If you look at the data, at the metrics going back for more than 10 years now, every year the Taliban grow in strength. So what you have is, you have, to just use a colloquialism, you're adding fuel to the fire. And we knew this. We knew this both from Iraq. We knew this in Afghanistan. Look, when I was in Iraq, we would capture foreign fighters occasionally. 96%, 97% of the people who were fighting us in Iraq were Iraqis. They were not coming from, there were some that were coming from Libya and Saudi Arabia and Yemen. But, and the same thing is happening in Afghanistan. Almost everyone we're capturing, everyone we're fighting is Afghan. It's rare to find a passport on somebody or some way to connect them back to, because even the ones that are coming from Pakistan are coming from the refugee camps, so that they are originally Afghans themselves. But so as you're adding, what we knew from these men that we capture is, why are you fighting us? You'd always ask that question in our interrogations. And the answer would be 90% of the time, the answer would be because you're occupying our country. And it was very simple. And in 2009, actually, as the debate was escalating in the U.S. about the war in Afghanistan, a report to that effect was leaked to the Boston Globe. And it was published, I think, in September of 2009, a U.S. intelligence report that states exactly that. 90% of the people who are fighting us, who make up the Taliban, are fighting us because we're occupying them. And, and you saw this. And so the result was, as we put more troops into Afghanistan, as we enlarged the Afghan government, as we gave it more capabilities, the Afghan government, the insurgency grew in strength. So you never see any progress. You never see any success, because each year, as the war goes on, the Taliban are able to launch more attacks. They're able to kill more people. They're able to put more roadside bombs on the ground, et cetera. And the only time those numbers change is when Western forces start to leave. And then you see a drop in attacks. But what you then see is an increase in attacks, right, against Afghan forces. And now, if you look at the numbers each year, the number of attacks continues to grow. And this is why the Taliban have no interest. And I agree completely with Marvin and Ben, the Taliban, and I saw Carlotta shaking her head. So you got all four of us in agreement on this, that the Taliban are not going to make any more concessions, because they've been winning. They've been winning for years, and they continue to go stronger each year. And I think that's what comes back to it is, and you've had people say this. Hamid Karzai has said it. Sherrod Cooper-Coles, who was the British ambassador to Afghanistan, has said it. The biggest impediment to peace in Afghanistan was the American assistance on military victory. And I can tell you that was exactly what was the case. In 2009, 2010, that's one of the main reasons why I resigned, was that there was no interest in the United States in finding a non-military solution. That the issue was for the Americans to win militarily, because you couldn't give the Pentagon credit for winning in Iraq. You had to give them credit for, give them a chance in Afghanistan, show that President Obama is a better wartime president than a Republican, et cetera, et cetera. All the domestic political considerations come in. And there was no interest in negotiating up until these last couple of years. And at that point, you have given away any leverage. You have given away any reason for the other side to negotiate. Look, I used to take part in simulations with the Marine Corps and with the Pentagon, and we would go through negotiations, what a simulated negotiation would be like with the Afghans. And continually, I did this in 09, 10, 11, and continually, even then, the Taliban was always stronger when it came down to negotiations. And I think that comes back to the whole folly of it, right? This idea that you're going to somehow go into another country. And I agree with what Marvin said earlier about this being civil wars. In 2001, we enter into a civil war, take one side out of power, put the other side in power. And then, and this is a decades-long civil war, right? And the predation that thing goes on, that causes the Taliban to be pulled back in from Pakistan, because people in the South and the East are looking for that kind of support, because they feel like they're being preyed on by rivals in a civil war that are being backed by a foreign government. And so this idea that somehow you're going to come in, you're going to throw some money around, you're going to pick winners and losers in a country that's been suffering at war for decades, and that then you're going to be able to win militarily. So we shouldn't be surprised that we're at the situation where the Taliban do have the upper hand and are in a position of strength. And as I agree with everyone else, they're not going to make any more concessions. But the alternative is to continue fighting.
So before I go on to talking about the last few years, I did want to talk very briefly about the weaknesses of the Karzai and the Ghani administrations. And Carlotta, if you could give us a brief overview of what it was whether it be the North-South divide, tribalism, so on, which stopped successful administration. And then, Ben, if you could tell us about the sentiment about these administrations on the ground.
I would pick up on Matthew there. I saw the Taliban resurgence very closely because I was in the villages a lot. And it wasn't support against Karzai, because the South, they loved Karzai. He was from the South. He was their guy. They supported him wholeheartedly in 2001. It was because the Taliban came in and was tougher and stronger. And the Taliban told them this message: we're coming back. And people in the Afghan villages, people go with the wind. They've learned how to survive. So they learned how to actually have one son in the communist army and one son with the Mujahideen. And now they do the same. They survive. If the Taliban comes, they're not going to fight them. They're going to go with the wind. So that's what happened in 2006. People accepted the Taliban. They don't like the Taliban because they're police. They run a police state, but they accepted their back. We have to work with them. And I would also argue that actually the surge did work in Kandahar province. If you read my book, I don't want to plug it, but it was fascinating to see. It only really changed in 2013. I went down there. So several years after the surge, but people saw that the security was staying, the national police were working, there was a strong man in charge who managed to bring peace and security for people. And they came over, they rejected the Taliban wholeheartedly in the south part of the province and kicked them out, and came wholeheartedly over to the government. And it has stayed since. So in that one critical province, the surge worked. And my argument is give it time to work. And it could work. I mean, I think the whole effort in Helmand and Marja was, completely misconstrued. Who cared about Marja, quite frankly? But Kandahar was important. It was their former capital. It is the center of the South. Anyway, and it's still loyal to the government. The Taliban have very little sway in Kandahar, which is interesting, still today. So anyway, under Karzai, of course, what happened was that he wasn't a very good administrator. He's a good guy. People did love him at the beginning. He really talked for the whole country. I met people up in the Wakhan corridor who just adored him. Across the country at the beginning, there was widespread support. And then, of course, he was a lousy administrator, excuse my language, and he couldn't run the country very effectively. He was very good at bringing everyone into the tent. So he brought his opponents in. So he had a united government, but he couldn't deliver to the people. He couldn't, in the end, keep the peace. And as the Taliban rose, I saw him very confused because he didn't want to call them even Taliban. He didn't want to call them opponents of his government because he felt, these are my people, these are my Pashtuns. So he was very conflicted, and he became increasingly distressed at the loss of civilian lives and the casualties, which was appalling for all of us to watch because it just kept happening. And that's why I named my book The Wrong Enemy, because in the end, the Americans were killing Afghans in villages when the real culprit was across the border, in the Quetta Shura and in the Pakistani intelligence headquarters. And that's what became very distressing for Karzai. And he, if you recall, he became very anti-American in more and more of his speech. He then felt that there was an effort to unseat him or have him lose the election. And so became very bitter and very uncooperative. And so the Obama administration came in, they had very little time for him. And we saw it go from bad to worse, that relationship.
Ben, if you wanted to jump in on this.
Yeah, the perception of the government in Helmand, where I spent most of my time, and which had so many resources, was bad and got worse very quickly. I mean, countless villagers said to me, "Look, all we care about is security and justice." And whenever you say this, you get accused of saying that the Taliban are good, or you're supporting the Taliban in some way. But repeatedly they said the Taliban are the ones who provide security and justice far better than the Afghan security forces. And you have to separate them. The army have, in many places done a good job, although they do lose to the Taliban every time they fight them face to face. The police are awful. The Afghan local police, essentially paid militias, are awful. The CIA-backed squads as well. And even the police chief who I mentioned earlier, I said to him, this was at a time, this was 2 years ago, when most of Helmand was controlled by the Taliban, and Lashkar, the provincial capital, was only stopped from falling to the Taliban because of US airstrikes. It was basically surrounded and being attacked from all sides at all times. The police chief said to me, I said, you must come into contact all the time with people who are now living under Taliban rule again. What did they say to you? And he said, they say they're happy. They leave their stuff out at night. Their children are safe. They don't get taxed at checkpoints. And they are pragmatic. They do go with who's likely to remain and who's strongest. But you heard that sentiment from them very, very often.
Mm. And if you could tell us a bit about specifically this culture of chai boys and the way the police operated in Afghani villages.
I mean, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that certainly in Helmand, I've spoken to people who have trained and mentored the police elsewhere. Almost every police commander had one or two chai boys. Yeah. And before green on blue attacks became a major problem and US or UK soldiers shared bases with Afghan police, they often reported hearing the abuse in neighbouring rooms and being unable to do anything about it. I've got several Marines who I'm still in contact with now whose military careers were ended because they did speak out about it or tried to stop it. In some cases, they actually beat up police commanders who they knew were raping young boys. And when we were at the very least turning a blind eye to that, it's amazing that you expect to be able to win hearts and minds. And that, as I think I said earlier, was just one of the many crimes being carried out by the Afghan National Police, Community Police, and Afghan local police as well.
Final question from me to Marvin before we take a question from our members. I just wanted to ask, why did it take until December 2014 for the US and NATO to formally end their combat mission in Afghanistan through the bilateral agreement, even though this was something that was decided in 2011?
Well, the surge really had as its goal here a test of the notion here. Remember, Obama was not in favor of putting additional troops in initially, but was convinced by his military that what was necessary here was just simply a more of a try, more of an effort. And so he built into it the idea that we will commit these troops and let them prove by 2014, when they should be then have left, they will start leaving shortly before, that they can bring about a change. And the idea was here to make a case of the most difficult areas, Helmand and Kandahar. If you could pacify these areas, then you could, in effect, start some kind of momentum here, which would give the Afghan security forces then an advantage. In other words, the contagion of this would spread. There would never be enough time to then carry that kind of effort to adjoining provinces. And that was really, I think, where it failed. The fact that it did not catch on, if you will. The effort here, I think, fell short, clearly, because we didn't sustain it. If we had wanted to sustain it, we could have at some price. But as everybody recognized, unless there was more than simply a military effort, this could not be sustained over the long term. And that meant, just as Ben points out, that we had to offer what obviously was not being offered, and that was assurance of security and also the very basic ideas of justice here. The justice system in Afghanistan under the state has been one which is riddled with corruption, in which even decisions that are made can be overturned by the next person who's willing to pay for it. So these things had to be addressed. They talked about having a package in which the government then had to play a major role here in carrying on the successes that were made. So it's it's a difficult situation to begin with, but it required that everybody step up, and that was just simply not within the capacity, or perhaps even in some cases the interest of the Kabul government.
Just to add to what Marvin said, I mean, most of the Afghan forces now, or for many years, don't even take prisoners because they know that if they turn them over to the judicial system, they'll probably be out in 2 weeks because they have high-powered connections. So most prisoners are killed on the spot. At the same time, you have, I mean, it's a small number now, but you have some women in prison for the moral crime of fleeing an abusive husband who probably is the result of an arranged marriage. Just some details to back up what you said.
No, and if I could just jump in, Mahi, real quick, because again, being in both Iraq and Afghanistan during the surges and taking part in them, in Iraq, in 2007, 2008, 2006, 2007, when I was in Anbar province, which was the second deadliest province in Iraq after the capital, Baghdad, in my regiment's AO, or area of operations, we would have 100 attacks a day during the fall, up to 100 attacks a day. And then by the winter of 2007, a couple months later, that had dropped to single digits. And you never saw that see what happened in Afghanistan. The same thing never occurred, even though you're using the same type of counterinsurgency tactics and all that other stuff. And what it comes down to is that in Iraq, what we did, where there had been Shia troops led by Shia officers underneath Shia politicians in Sunni areas, which is where the insurgency was I'm talking about, we replaced them with locals, with Sunnis. And we never did that in Afghanistan. So when I was in Zabul province, which is one province over from Kandahar in the south, we had 7 Afghan senior officers in the Afghan army. And only 2 of them could speak Pashto, could speak the language of the people. In that area down there, it's all 100% Pashto. And the same thing, too. The Afghan National Army was only, at most 5% Southern Pashtun. So what we never did was, one, we never brought the local people really into power, right? We never gave them a sense of say in their own affairs. And the troops that we had over them were not from that area. They were from, we called the ANA the Army of the Northern Alliance, because everywhere you went, you would see these giant posters of Ahmad Shah Massoud. You would see, posters of him in the ANA or AMP trucks, right? And it signified to the local people that this was an army of occupation, that this was a continuation of the Civil War. And so you never had, not getting into the broad aspects of power sharing agreements, but actual local agency. We never gave the people in southern Afghanistan the local control that we had done in the Sunni regions of Iraq that brought the violence down, that took away the grievances of the insurgency. Because if you don't take away the grievances of the insurgency, or if you don't address them, they're just going to keep fighting.
Mm-hmm. Our final question, thank you for that, Matthew, comes from Johnny at New College. It's a very broad question, and Carlos, I wanted to direct it to you. The others can feel free to jump in after. It goes, Western forces haven't won a counterinsurgency-based war since Britain fought Malaya in the 1960s. In the wake of inter alia Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, is counterinsurgency a failed conflict resolution strategy that needs to stop?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, and also, how do you decide? Because if you talk to the British Army, I think they would say they did win in Northern Ireland, although obviously it was a peace deal that finished that. One thing I think when it comes to looking at counterinsurgency is you have to cut off the supply line and the safe haven of the next door country, and that's what I understood was always the problem in Afghanistan. They always had, the Taliban leaders could live in Pakistan, they could always retreat and rest up in Pakistan, and they always had supply lines in from Pakistan. And so if you were going to do a surge or fight an insurgency, and still now, you can't do it if you can't clear or stop that adjoining country from from helping run it. And I think that's why, I think in Malaya, if I recall, that's how they were able to do it, is that they could encircle it and work on the hearts and minds without that outside connection. And also picking up on Matthew's point, in my experience, it was the Pakistani view and push that terrified people from allowing their sons to go and join the army. I know southern Pashtuns whose sons did run off and join the army, and the families called them back because they had such threats from the Taliban, but that all came from the Pakistani leadership in Quetta. So there was a very rigid control of the Taliban message on the southern population. And so if you can't cut that, you can't defeat an insurgency. And then insurgencies on the whole run, I think, for the average of 14 years. And so you also need time on your hands. I think insurgencies are incredibly difficult to fight, that's for sure. And could perhaps argue that no one wins them; they just, in the end, die out or end up in a peace deal or in a new way of living.
Can I just come in on this for a
very
moment?
briefly?
Very briefly. I think certainly the assistance that the Taliban received from Afghanistan, indeed, perhaps the instructions that they received, has to be seen, though, as a phenomenon which has changed. As the Taliban have ensconced themselves so much more thoroughly in Afghanistan now, they do become less dependent, at least, than they were on Pakistan. And you get the phenomenon now where Pakistan, when they hear Taliban spokespeople say, well, if you don't want us, we'll leave. It is, no, don't do that, recognizing that if they do, they lose their leverage over them. Mm-hmm. They want them, in a sense, the leadership certainly, still in Pakistan. But we would be, I think, overestimating Pakistan's role now if we didn't recognize that their influence on the Taliban has real limitations. It always has. But even more so now, when they are able to operate, are now able to raise their own funds to the extent that they can, not through Pakistan necessarily, but from all the sources we spoke about before. So it is an evolving picture. It has been.
Any final statements from Ben or Matthew?
Well, just with regard to Pakistan, the man who just signed the peace agreement, or it's not a peace agreement, right? It's the first phase in this peace process. Mullah Baradar was arrested by the Pakistanis and the U.S. in 2010. And at that time, he was the second in command of the Afghan Taliban for trying to negotiate with the Afghan government. So, as Marvin said, there's plenty of times and plenty of examples of the Afghan Taliban being at odds with the Pakistani government. And it's also important to remember, too, that the Afghan Taliban, we use this term Taliban, and there are so many levels to it, so many different constituencies, so many different organizations. It's by no way a monolith. Certainly there are some.
This is what's fascinating about the Taliban, that it has stayed. When you think of the 7 Mujahideen groups that fought the Russians and then all the Iranian-backed ones, the Taliban is extraordinary in that it stayed a monolith and it still obeys its commander and it still thinks together. And that's the extraordinary power, I think, that Pakistan has enforced on them.
Matthew,
but what's the most interesting thing that Matthew raises is who put pressure on Pakistan to release Mullah Baradar? That's where the power lies, and that's the answer to a negotiated peace.
And he was only
released. Respond to that quickly, and then we'll go to Ben to end with.
Well, I think what I heard is Saudi Arabia asked Pakistan to do it at the request of Zalmay Khalilzad.
That's widely reported. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I can get into all different stuffs about the order of battle of the Taliban, and it's the same way too. I mean, I think this description, you had three major groups. You had the Haqqanis, you had Hezbollah, Gulbuddin, you had in the Quetta Shura Taliban. But then I can tell you from being there on the ground and working with these guys and being with our special forces and being in the villages and everything, and not places we ever took reporters or anything like that, that the majority of the fighters were local Afghans, and they stayed in the valleys and the villages in which they belong. And while the Taliban leadership, both military and political, were based in Pakistan, you never had more than, say, in a province, 40 or so what we would call regular Taliban at one time. The rest were all these local groups that the Taliban, through a variety of methods, and again, I'm using depending upon where you are, there are different organizations or elements of the Taliban. Certainly up in the east, if you go up in Nangarhar and Kunar and Logman and Nuristan, it's a different set. So yes, was there an umbrella that they fell underneath that at the titular head was the Quetta Shura Taliban leadership? Yes, but also too, it wasn't that simple, and that you would say in the same way that U.S. forces all fall underneath General Stanley McChrystal or General Petraeus. It was never that easy, and there was certainly a lot of sway in what the local Taliban groups did and how they operated, how they communicated with each other. It was very very localized phenomena that I think plays into the localized phenomena of how Afghan rural life is. It was a direct reflection of that.
I'd like to say, just going forwards, I really hope we pay a lot of attention to what's happening now, because certainly when I speak to my Afghan friends, they think that the US is going to withdraw in April of next year, and we're not even sure what withdraw means. Does it mean that all the troops come home? Does it mean we stop paying the salaries of the police and army and others? In which case, we'll have defections and desertions on a massive scale, and the Taliban will have a very easy time taking cities. Does it mean we stop bailing out the Afghan security forces with airstrikes? But many of my Afghan friends think that the US could withdraw without the Taliban even talking to the Afghan government, let alone reaching an agreement, without offering any guarantees on women's rights. And that makes the situation that was described earlier, where 3 years after the Soviet withdrawal, the government fell, that makes that look optimistic as an outcome, given the attitude of the Taliban right now, who still refer to the current government as a puppet government and an illegitimate government.
Thank you.
Just one thought, and that is, should we distinguish between the field Taliban and the political leadership? I think that we'll have to keep that in mind, because there are indications here that they are conscious of one another and how far they can go. And whereas they are unified, and that stands out very clearly, because as we watch this negotiating process and the government side broken up into all of the different factions about what they want from a agreement, you have one voice speaking at this point for the Taliban. So whether that voice is in any way constricted by what they think the field commanders and their own troops will stand for, I think has to be factored into the equation.
Thank you very much, Marvin. And thank you all so much for joining us here today. I think this leaves lots of interesting questions for us to pick up on in our next episode. Thank you.